A lot of the work that I do is in residential. I do some commercial, but the next time you take a flight somewhere, you're at the airport, the airplane takes off out of the sky, up into the sky. You look over the warehouse district that commonly surrounds an airport, and there's a whole bunch of empty, flat rooftops. Don't have anything on them. And it's, that to a solar installer is painful. I'm more likely to see a solar array right here on a little small residential rooftop than I am on a big flat open space that would make a much better job site. And commercial businesses are open during the day and closed at night, and so their load profile is more closely associated with when solar power is being produced. And so there's less issue with outflowing onto the grid and net metering bill credits than there is with residential. And still, these open flat rooftops are empty. In fact, you look at this graph, and it's still pretty true, if not more exaggerated, where the commercial solar market segment is the smallest market segment out of utility scale, residential, and commercial. And this did not always hold true. When I got into the industry back in 2008, the commercial solar market was really roaring to market. The utility scale didn't really exist. Residential had always existed, and at the time it was more of a luxury market, although in 2008, 2009, 2010, there was an era of heavy solar subsidies, where often the owner of the project was only paying, maybe 20% of the project cost because they were getting not only the 30% federal tax credit, but also state and local incentives. And that made it so that a large project could, really come out of the ground and grab a big subsidy check. And the value of that solar electricity was not nearly as much as the value of the subsidies. And so, back when in 2008, 2009, when there were local solar incentives of substantial value to be had, we saw this uptick in interest in developing larger project sites on the roof. Well, those subsidies have by and large faded out. We still do have the 30% solar tax credit, and it was originally supposed to expire at the end of 2016, and so we can see how subsidies kind of craft the solar market in ways that unsubsidized business models would not. For example, even though the solar tax credit was indeed extended, we still had this giant, backlog of projects, some being delayed until when they thought, right before when they thought the project would expire, and others trying to cram in at the last minute to beat that deadline. And so when the tax credit got extended, towards the middle of 2016, it's not like a lot of these projects, just immediately got put on hold. We saw a huge rush in utility scale. For that matter, the tax credit only got off the ground at the tail end of 2008. And what the tax credit, the way the solar tax credit is different than like the Carter era tax credit is the Carter era tax credit had a budget cap. Once you went over it was actually a 40% tax credit, but it was capped at $10,000. The solar tax credit in its modern form has no upper limit. And so when that tax credit got out of the ground in 2008, what we see is, well, actually the commercial solar market was the largest market segment between 2008 and 2010, but your major project underwriters of utility scale power plants said, well, let's start doing solar. And so, what's larger than a commercial project is utility scale. And with that unlimited tax credit, you're going to get a lot more bang for your buck doing 100 megawatts of solar versus 100 kilowatts of solar. And so, to some extent, while the commercial solar market heavily benefited from state and local incentives, when the federal incentive came on the market, the game changed and the market shifted towards, oh, well, these state and local incentives are very volatile. They run out of money. They run out of budget. That tax credit at the federal level is almost a blank check. So let's just do utility scale markets focused on the federal tax credit and not care about state or local incentives so much. And so what we saw over the next few years is the commercial market stagnated in growth and the utility scale market really took off. The residential market continued to grow, and that was because at the residential level, you have a policy called net metering, where you get it's not a perfect match, and net metering is certainly controversial, but at a very high level, net metering says if you put a kilowatt hour of energy out onto the grid, you get a kilowatt hour of energy credit that then gets applied to your bill. And so through policy with net metering, the residential market continued to grow. Now, not all states have net metering, and in states that have worse solar policy, you do not see as large of a residential market as states that have robust net metering. And that's really a discussion for other classes, but I mentioned this because we have the 30% tax credit benefiting utility scale in particular. And then we have net metering benefiting residential in particular. Now, why does net metering not benefit the commercial market? I mean, the residential market is point of use. The commercial market is point of use. In fact, there's a little bit better of an overlap. So really, at the commercial level, net metering is less controversial because more of the energy stays on site. In other words, the commercial market is less reliant on net metering than residential. So you would think the commercial market in an era of the solar tax credit, in an era of net metering, that the commercial market would be booming. This is not the case. Actually, and it hasn't been the case for the last 10 years, but now the commercial market is booming. In fact, the wheel has come completely around. The commercial market's the fastest growing market segment in the industry, in part because it's been suppressed in the past, and so it didn't experience the growth that other markets segments did. But the growth today is being driven by another component, which is batteries. To fully understand that, we need to talk a little bit more about cost. Utility scale projects are cheaper per watt. Solar pricing is done by the watt. Utility scale projects are much cheaper than residential projects. The main difference is not the cost of the module or Yes, the inverter cost for residential is more expensive than the inverter cost for utility scale. But to some extent, residential uses the structure of the house to support the array on the rooftop, whereas you're doing a lot more, foundational work with a utility scale project. So, inverter costs are less for utility scale, but the racking costs are more. The labor costs for commercial utility scale are less, but labor is not a major factor in your project budget. The greatest difference between residential and utility scale is this top bar, which is referred to as soft cost, which is your markup on your material, the profit and overhead administrative expense that the developer charges, sales commissions, things like that. And so there's simply, like a sales commission, at the residential level might be 3 to 5% of a project cost, particularly if you're going with a national company or using a lead referral service. Whereas, that sales commission does not exist at the utility scale. So, the main difference between residential small projects and utility scale large projects is that there's quite a large reduction in the profit taking and overhead. As there should be, it's a larger project, there's economies of scale. I mean, as an installer, you would rather work on these larger projects because it's more reliable work and you're still getting paid well. It's just as a percentage of your total project budget, all these costs shrink down compared to residential. So commercial is right here in the middle. And what we need to remember about commercial is that it too has a dramatic reduction in soft cost compared to residential. A 300 kilowatt solar array has substantially lower installation price than a 10 kilowatt solar array. So the economies of scale in a solar project, where we see a price decrease for the larger the project gets, we've already achieved the substantial savings of economies of scale by the time we get to commercial. But a utilities market, which we already saw was a larger market today than commercial, utilities generate at wholesale electric pricing, or sometimes even less, more towards the raw cost of energy, the avoided cost of energy. So we're seeing utility scale projects go in at, let's just call it, there's some that are less than that, but let's just call it 4 cents a kilowatt hour, whereas the national average price of electricity is closer to 12 cents a kilowatt hour. And commercial customers pay about the same per kilowatt hour as residential customers. And so, even though commercial has the economies of scale discount that you get with utility scale solar, you still have point of use generation. And so you would think that point of use generation would result, especially when that energy is not outflowing onto the grid, but being consumed and used on site, so you can get retail savings even without net metering. For all those reasons, you would think commercial solar would be the optimal application of grid-tied solar. The most valuable application of grid-tied solar should be point-of-use generation that can provide retail savings on a large project site. And so a flat, open commercial rooftop, it's like, man, this should be the best application of solar, and yet it's the smallest market segment. So why is that? Well, it's not just about how much energy you produce, it's about how much that energy is worth. And utility scale projects, they can go and get 20, 30-year contracts that define the rate of their electricity and develop a project off that, even though it's razor thin. And of course, residential, they get some protections by net metering, and often those net metering protections do include commercial, but obviously there's something going wrong because the commercial market segment is so low. Just to kind of summarize again, I guess we just kind of went over this, but, retail generation has a higher rate than utility scale generation. Utility scale, they have to mark up the price of electricity before it gets to the house, whereas when you put solar at point of use, you're generating electricity that already has that markup built in. And so, the utility scale sector can say, you know what, we're the best at solar because we can do these giant projects at, half the cost of what it takes to do residential. And the residential market could say, yeah, but our electricity is worth twice as much. So there's that battle between big solar, utility scale generation, and point of use. I like point of use. I mean, you can't put a natural gas power plant or a nuclear reactor, on top of your rooftop. I guess we do have gas generators, so that's a little disingenuous, but not all areas allow your house just to be run off a gas generator every single day of the year because of air quality issues. A little bit more on the outflow issue. Residential solar, most customers, when you buy solar, you want to get rid of your electric bill. That's just why you do it. But solar only produces in, let's call it an 8-hour window. The day's 24 hours long. So, if you're trying to offset 100% of your bill, 2/3 of your system production is going to be outflowed onto the grid, and you're going to have to get a retail credit for that outflow to fully eliminate your bill. And as we talk about in our off-grid class, that is being subject to rollbacks and net metering. Really what they're doing out here in the southeast United States is not increasing the price of electricity, but increasing the fixed fees of electricity. Your meter fee, the fixed price. And so that way they can get rid of, even if you have net metering, they can just stop raising the price of electricity and only raise the fixed fees. And that waters down the value of net metering. So that's kind of a risk that residential has. Is it's still very much exposed to utility policy. The policy has been very good on average, and so we've seen growth in residential, but the risk is still there that that policy could go away. That's a hint as to why commercial has not grown so much. And so, I'm not trying to spend too much time talking about residential or utility scale issues, but, residential arrays have this outflow issue, and all it takes is for the power company to say, you know what, we're not going to give you 12 cents a kilowatt hour for your outflow. we're only going to give you 3 cents a kilowatt hour for your outflow, and all of a sudden the market for residential solar goes away. In Mississippi, this is the case, and the bulk majority of the solar projects that I sell in Mississippi include large battery banks to store the electricity. And even that is not particularly cost effective because, batteries cost, even the cheapest battery on the market costs 8 cents a kilowatt hour to cycle. And so, all the utility needs to do is take this buyback rate, and if the retail value is 12 cents, all they need to do is really offer about 5 cents to make storing the energy in your battery less cost effective than selling back at the reduced rate. Most of my customers at that point say, well, yeah, but I don't want to give any more of my money to the power company who's giving me this raw deal. I'd rather spend more money on myself than give them a penny. We call that a spiteful battery. But it does ruin the market. When you don't have that good outflow credit for residential, you don't have a residential market. And, the writing's on the wall. Utilities are explicitly stating that they are going to punish on-site renewable owners because of revenue loss, which presumably increases the cost on non-participants, although that's a very incomplete equation. So while most states have net metering, those net metering rights are always going to be under attack and always going to be subject to being rolled back. The reason why commercial does not benefit from net metering is that they are billed differently for electricity than residential. So here's an example of a commercial electric bill. And you could say, okay, this commercial electric bill is $4,000. And they have used, how many kilowatt hours have they used? They've used 10,000 kilowatt hours. All right. Well, probably don't need a calculator to do this, but $4,666 divided by 10,000 kilowatt hours. That's actually pretty expensive. That's 40 cents a kilowatt hour. That's very expensive. And so you'd say, okay, well, I'm going to put a solar array on this job site, and I'm going to generate at 40 cents a kilowatt hour. Well, that's not actually true. If you look at how this bill is calculated, you can say, okay, well, there's an energy charge for those 10,000 kilowatt hours, and it's being billed at a penny a kilowatt hour. 10,000 kilowatt hours of electricity only comprise $70 of this $4,000 bill. That's not completely true. There's this rate adjustment issue. Then there's this energy cost adjustment issue. So this is another, kilowatt hour fee. Here's another tenth of a penny a kilowatt hour fee. And then you have other fees like 2% taxes and 3% taxes and 5%, 3.5%, and 1%, and 9% that'll all be bundled together. But even so, if we said all of these other little tiny charges, let's just say were kilowatt hour fees, we're ignoring the elephant in the room, which is the vast majority of this commercial electric bill is right here. and it comes from what's called a demand charge. And if we look closely, this demand charge is measured not in kilowatt hours, but in kilowatts. You know, a kilowatt energy is a function of power over time. So power is in kilowatts and time is in hours, and their multiplier is the area under this curve. That's kilowatt hours. You know, energy is the area under the curve. Kilowatts is the maximum height of the curve, is your maximum demand. I was just doing this for another customer. Let me pull up, their bill. And so here we have another bill where, their energy is being billed at 3-4 cents a kilowatt hour, plus another tenth of a penny, minus another tenth of a penny, plus some sales taxes. And so their energy is only 4 cents a kilowatt hour, and their demand charge is $20 per kilowatt. And so they're using, in this particular case, let's see if it's any different, their bill is $7,479, and their energy usage is 4,480 kilowatt hours. They're paying 15 cents a kilowatt hour effectively, but how they got there is a lot different, because what we can see is only 4 out of this 15 cents, less than a third of that electric bill is actually energy related. 2/3 of the electric bill is demand related. And so that's where net metering falls short. That's where net metering really fails the, let's see here, I'll present this. That's where net metering really fails a commercial customer, is that the net metering only applies to the energy charge. So net metering does not apply to demand. It only applies to energy. And so if your energy rate is 3 or 4 cents a kilowatt hour, and your solar array is reducing it by 3 or 4 cents a kilowatt hour, that's going to be wholly uneconomic. You need a utility scale project for a 3 or 4 cent a kilowatt hour rate to make sense. Not something that you can do on a commercial roof. And so even though the commercial market has had the tax credit, and even though they've had net metering, they have not had the ability to save money by solar, which is kind of ridiculous, because again, their facility demand charges are often occurring in the middle of the day when their air conditioners are going full blast. And often the building's energy use will drop at night when the building is empty. And so you would think that solar producing energy during demand times and commercial users with demand-based rate structures, that would be a natural fit. And it is for most days of the month. For most days of the month, here in dark blue is this facility's peak electrical demand. And so before solar, their peak demand is occurring in the middle of the day, and then it drops off at night when the building is not used. And solar, we can see, is producing in the middle of the day. And so what we're seeing in light blue is the adjusted rate structure where solar, it's not doing anything in the morning, but then the solar array begins to kick on as the building demand is ramping up, and it's keeping that demand flat. And then as the solar array really begins to crank away in the middle of the day, the demand drops even below its base load, and then in the evening it comes back up again. And so what we see here in this graph is the solar array has reduced the demand of the building rather substantially on this particular day. But still there's no demand savings. And the reason why there's no demand savings is that the building's demand could spike in the morning, one day of the month. Let's say there was a big material delivery and the doors of the building were wide open and all that air conditioning is blowing out the doors. Or let's say it's in the wintertime and you're turning on your heaters right before everybody shows up to work. Or let's say a cloud. It was a partly cloudy day, not enough to affect your air conditioning use, not like an overcast day when your air conditioners might be running at a lower level. But let's say it was a partly cloudy day and there was just one, jerk of a cloud in the sky that comes in and turns off, the solar array for 15 minutes. What that would do is it would cause your demand to spike up to what it was and back down again for that 15 minutes. And demand charges are based off what is the maximum height of this curve for the entire month. And so 29 days out of 30, your solar array could be reducing your peak demand charge. But that one day, tragedy occurs. A cloud comes and sits on top of your solar array, your demand spikes to what it would be without solar, and that eliminates the entire demand savings from your bill for that month. And keep in mind that demand charge can be 2/3 to 3/4 of your electric bill. And so that's, it's ironic that solar produces demand electricity during the day, and we have businesses needing demand electricity during the day that are only open during the day, that have these big open rooftops, and it is not subsidies but billing structure that is holding back this market. It's really a tragedy. And so now we can see, whereas like the utility scale, they have power purchase agreements, they're not subject to demand-based billing structures. And residential as well, it's uncommon to have a demand-based billing structure at the residential level. Sometimes you can get them optionally. But the commercial market, because of the demand-based billing structure, has been suppressed and has not been able to enjoy solar ownership because of that. Not all facilities have their peak demand occurring right in the middle of the day. So I guess that's another problem. For example, a farming operation may be feeding their cows at 4 a.m. in the morning. And so they'll see their energy use spike at 4 a.m. in the morning because they're running conveyor belts and grain mills and all this jazz, and then not using any other power for the rest of the day. Or buildings that are on electric heat in particular, they might be shooting themselves in the foot a little bit because they're not running their electric heaters throughout the night because that's using your heaters is expensive. And so they just turn the heaters on right before everyone shows up to work. Well, that's actually an incredibly costly way to do it because it spikes their demand. Maybe it would have been better to keep the building warm throughout the night and have a higher base load and less of this spiky load. This is actually kind of interesting because when I look at a commercial electric bill with the topic of today's program, commercial solar peakers, I am now looking for very spiky electric bills because a small project, you can just go in and shave off the spikiest spikes and not worry about anything else under the curve, which is kind of interesting. A small project is usually less cost effective than a large project. A utility scale project installs for less money than a residential project. But in the unique case of commercial solar peakers, it is possible to do a smaller project and have that be the most cost effective because you're just targeting the spikiest of peaks. Whereas, if you wanted to do something more substantial or even get rid of the entire electric bill, you would need a much larger project. And what we're going to see is the combination of solar and batteries allows you to go after the spikiest of peaks. And so the philosophy on a commercial solar peaker is not to completely eliminate the electric bill. Instead, you want something that is more cost effective than if you were to completely eliminate the electric bill. If you completely eliminate your electric bill, that is the same thing as getting a 1-for-1 net metering credit. But if I can take a kilowatt hour of solar electricity generated and then store it in a battery and deploy it at the exact time when electricity cost is the highest, it's not a 1-for-1 exchange. It might be a 1-for-2 or 1-for-3 or 1-for-10 exchange. And so, in other words, reducing your energy use by 10% with a solar array, but deploying that electricity at peak times with a battery can reduce your electric bill by 30 or 40%, even though you're only generating 10% of your electricity on site. For that matter, you might not need a solar array. You might just need a battery. So we're going to talk about those cases as the course progresses. What follows then is the higher your demand charge, the more cost-effective a commercial solar peaker can be. Now that's ironic, because it used to be that the higher your demand charge, the lower your energy rate, and so the less cost-effective solar would become. And so we only see solar in areas where the energy rate is high. And in the past, we've seen utilities try and force solar customers onto demand charges in an attempt to stymie the growth in the sector. And so if anything, the trend from utilities has been to run away from energy rate structures and towards demand structures and stacking, saying, okay, well, we'll just sell you the electricity at 3 or 4 cents a kilowatt hour, sometimes even less than that, but we're going to give you a very expensive demand charge. And what we're seeing is the higher that demand charge, the more cost effective a commercial solar peaker becomes. So let's put some costs together. Now the Tesla Powerwall 2. Tesla says cost between $10,000 to $15,000 installed. So let's say it's $15,000 installed if you're just buying one of them, and let's say it's $10,000 installed if you're buying multiple Tesla Powerwalls. The Tesla Powerwall has an output of about 5 kilowatts. And it has about a 12 kilowatt hour battery, so it can run at 5 kilowatts for about 2.5 hours. And then its warranty is for 40,000 kilowatt hours of electricity. So, we look at, let's just say, $10,000 on the low end, divided by its warranted output of 40,000 kilowatt hours. You're like, well, the Tesla Powerwall, to cycle the batteries, that cycle costs 25 cents a kilowatt hour. And so if I'm like a residential customer and I'm being billed 12 cents a kilowatt hour for my electricity, but the utility is only going to pay me for 4 cents for my outflow. If I say, okay, well, I'm going to go buy a Tesla Powerwall and store my electricity in the Tesla Powerwall, and so instead of selling back to the utility at a cheap rate, I'll keep it and reduce my retail rate. Well, it's costing me 25 cents a kilowatt hour to do that. So I'm actually, going to lose money as a residential customer if I take that approach. And so where that's different with a commercial solar peaker is you can look at a commercial electric bill where the customer is paying 15 cents a kilowatt hour, and you would think, okay, well, how is it possible that if I'm effectively paying 15 cents a kilowatt hour, if I store it in a battery, and let's say the battery costs 25 cents to run, and let's just say the solar array costs 10 cents to install over its life. So the combination of the two, the solar plus the battery, costs 35 cents a kilowatt hour, and I'm paying 15 cents. How am I going to, from the grid, how am I going to save any money? Well, it's because the battery is not going to work every single day for every single kilowatt hour. It's only going to address the very spikiest peaks when you're effectively being billed much more than 15 cents a kilowatt hour for your electricity. Remember, really what you're being billed is 3 or 4 cents for your electricity, and then everything else is in demand charges. So you have to stop thinking about things in terms of the battery costs me 25 cents to run, or the solar array produces at 10 cents a kilowatt hour, and just look at it specifically as how much does the whole system cost to reduce my demand charge by how much. And you might find that you do too much. You might find that if you try and level your demand all the way down to here, you get into diminishing returns because you're going to have to run your system for all of this time. Whereas, you've already achieved a substantial amount of demand reduction by just running your system for a very small amount of time. And so let's look at the Tesla Powerwall. And let's assume that we're only going to run it for 4 hours a day on high demand days. And let's assume that we have 5 high demand days a month, where we want to reduce our load by, 5 kilowatts by running this battery for, 4 hours. at 5 kilowatts, and we're going to shave 5 kilowatts off the top of our load by doing that. And this analogy doesn't closely match this picture. This might only reflect 2 hours of operation instead of 4, but you don't really know how long that load is going to last. So we're just assuming 4 hours of operation to achieve a 5 kilowatt reduction. If I have a 9-cent energy rate and versus a 6-cent energy rate, I have a $10 demand charge versus a $20 demand charge. As far as the economics go, the energy rate really doesn't matter. It's really just the demand charge. And if your demand charge is twice as much, your payback is going to be, twice as quick. So we're going to show you how to do these calculations as a goal of the class. What's also interesting about this is the solar arrays don't have to be so large. If the battery is only going to be used 5 days a month, your solar array is producing energy every single day except for partly cloudy days. And so you don't need a solar array that covers the entire roof anymore. You really just want a solar array that's going to fill up the batteries. There's a little bit more nuance to that. There's a little bit more favorability that's going to come back towards having a decent solar array on the rooftop in a minute. But, the solar array is really playing second fiddle to the battery. So on a commercial array, that's a shallow tilt angle, 1 watt of solar is going to produce about 1.2 kilowatt hours a year. So 1 kilowatt is going to produce about 100 kilowatt hours per month. And maybe, at 5 kilowatts for 5 days, for 4 hours a day, some of that's going to go into the battery bank. That's 20 kilowatt hours. So our solar array is now going to be filling up the battery. But we don't want to be too conservative because we want to make sure that the solar array is actually charging the battery. If we go through a couple of high demand days in rapid succession, we want to make sure that the solar array is there enough to charge it back up. And so we will, err on the side of having a larger solar array rather than a smaller solar array. The important thing to note is that the batteries only qualify for the solar tax credit if they're solar powered. If your batteries are powered by the grid, they're not going to qualify for the tax credit. So sometimes it's just not, you don't even need, if you have an incredibly spiky load, the solar array may or may not add benefit. At other times, and we're going to get to this later in the program, but just like we saw a few slides back, the solar array by itself can actually reduce the demand of the building in the middle of the day. And so there is an optimization to say, well, you don't want to have to rely on your battery. Your battery's the safety. The battery's the thing that's not, their job is to make sure not one, spike in electric demand gets through so that you can achieve these demand reductions. But the solar array is like the defensive line. They're the ones who are reducing the demand throughout the day so that the battery doesn't have to work so hard. So the solar array is there to reduce the demand of the building during the day without the battery, and also to charge the battery so that it qualifies for the solar tax credit. So let's say we went and we bought 10 Tesla Powerwall 2s. Let's say they install for $100,000. 5 kilowatt output each, so they have 50 kilowatts of output. Let's say we're running them for 20 hours a month. At 50 kilowatt output, that says the batteries need a megawatt hour or 1,000 kilowatt hours of production a month. And erring on the side of conservatism, a 1 kilowatt array will produce about 50 kilowatt hours per month that can be dedicated towards charging the battery and be there when you need it to charge the battery. If you buy a battery and you buy a solar array and you take the 30% tax credit on the battery, but you end up not charging it with solar, you have to give the tax credit back. There's certain thresholds. It's like it has to be 80% solar powered to qualify. And if you claim the full tax credit, it has to be 100%. If the battery is only 90% solar powered, then you have to give back 10% of the tax credit. Not a huge deal. Generally, it would be better to take less of the tax credit and have the demand savings than the other way around. But really, I just wanted to give you an idea of, for a commercial solar peaker that is trying to level 50 kilowatts of spiky demand, which would be a more than a shoe store. If you have a 50 kilowatt spike in your demand, you're probably a grocery store, unless you're on electric heating. Then that could be even a smaller building. But it would only take about a 20 kilowatt solar array in terms of producing enough power for a battery to load level a 50 kilowatt spike. So that's kind of interesting. Usually commercial solar, you're thinking about filling up the entire rooftop, but in a commercial solar peaker, you could just pick the easiest section to install a solar array on and just do that only. There's less of an incentive. You will get into diminishing returns if you fill up the entire rooftop. So, really what you're looking for is a solar array size that will give you a good economies of scale, a cheaper than residential installation cost. But we're not talking about spending, out of a $1 million solar peaker project, out of that $1 million, you might only spend $100,000 on the solar array itself, with $900,000 going into the battery scope. So how do we put numbers to this? Well, it's all the way back to PV watts. We'll just do a real quick example. You've probably gotten PV watts if you've taken any of my other classes, but just for those who haven't, PV watts is run by the National Renewable Energy Labs. You put in your location, so let's just go ahead and do Louisville, Kentucky. When you put in Louisville, Kentucky, it's actually based, the data is based off local weather monitoring stations. So like here's a regional airport weather monitoring system. Here's another one. It doesn't look like Louisville really has too many around, but they average these numbers to create this map. So PV watts is based on local weather data, and I always do a PV watts calculation for a 1 kilowatt array because it creates a scalar. Commercial would be a roof mount array. I recommend leaving the system losses number as is. That'll produce a conservative estimate. Your tilts on a commercial roof are often 15 degrees. I don't recommend shallower tilts than that. And the reason is what we're seeing in the solar industry is that on a shallow tilt, even though you do get some rainwater runoff, you still get grime and dirt accumulating at the very bottom edge of the module. And so like on a residential roof, you're sloped at a 22-degree tilt angle, and the rainwater, let's just say you got your solar panel here, up above the rooftop. The rainwater is going to fall on that and then kind of clean the module and then fall off the bottom. But if you have a shallow tilt, yes, the rainwater is still going to go and fall off, but it's not going to clean the dirt on the modules as well. And so the shallower your tilt, the more grime you get on the modules. And if that grime is not cleaned, over time, when sunlight shines on the surface of the module, the grime will concentrate it onto one section of the module, and that can start to overheat the cells and burn up the cells. Not in a way that would cause a fire, but in a way that would cause the module to fail sooner rather than later. And so for those reasons, it's not good to have a perfectly flat array. And if you are given the option on shallower versus steeper tilt angles, giving it some kick, like a 15 degree is my recommendation for the least tilt. But anyway, we're doing a 1 kilowatt solar array in this example at a shallow tilt in Louisville, Kentucky, and click and go. And what PV Watts gives us is a estimate, not just an annual estimate, but also, a month by month estimate. And not just a month by month estimate, but you can actually go and download this data on an hourly basis. And that's gonna come play a important part in a minute. Let's get back to the program. We're going to come back to that. And so let's say we're doing a $140,000 project. And we do a 20 kilowatt solar array. Let's say we get a $2 a watt installation price on that. And, let's say we do 10 Tesla Powerwalls, and at $10,000 a piece, that each installed, that costs us $100,000 for our grand total project of $140,000. And that'll give us 20 kilowatts of solar that are more than adequate for charging our batteries to provide 50 kilowatts of instantly deployable demand management for about 20 hours a month. Well, then you get that 30% tax credit, and this is kind of where the cost effectiveness of the solar comes into question. Really, basically, we're using the tax credit to buy ourselves a free solar array. You could just do a $100,000 battery budget project and have the same demand savings achieved, except that we're hedging our bets a little, because what we gain by adding a 20 kilowatt solar array is we don't really have to worry about in the middle of the day doing demand management because we're not using the battery during that time. The solar array is reducing our midday demand by 20 kilowatts at the very least. And so it's not just that we're using, tax credit shenaniganery to buy ourselves a free solar array by qualifying not just the solar array, but also the more expensive batteries, thereby getting a large tax credit that is more than the cost of the solar array itself. We're also in the process hedging our bets and giving us a way to reduce the facility demand in the middle of the day without running the battery so that the battery doesn't have to work as hard. And obviously there's some stuff there is some advantage beyond just the demand reductions and the scope of this class in terms of, well, the building can now generate its own electricity, and so you can back up some critical loads so that, if, let's say this was on a grocery store, not only could this project reduce the grocery store's peak demand, but it could also protect their refrigerators in the event of a power outage. Stuff like that. So we're going to assume a few things. One, maybe we're not in Louisville, Kentucky. Maybe we're further up the East Coast where there's less sunny weather, so a little bit lower production figure. We saw with our PV watts calculation, 1 kilowatt produced 1,300 kilowatt hours a year, or 1 watt produces 1.3 kilowatt hours per watt per year. I always think that ratio is a good ratio to remember. Well, anyway, so we're assuming that half of our energy is going to charge the battery and the other half is going to reduce our electric bill at the kilowatt hour rate. And so if our kilowatt hour rate is 6 cents a kilowatt hour, our annual savings from the solar array are $750 a year. And the only reason why I mention that is that if, in addition to having a 6 cent a kilowatt hour energy rate, we also had a $20 a month demand charge that we're reducing by 50 kilowatts a month, then 50 kilowatts times $20 a kilowatt every single month, the demand savings is $12,000. So the demand savings from the battery component is substantially larger than the energy savings from the portion of the solar array that is not charging the battery. So, in other words, the bulk majority of a commercial solar peaker's value comes from demand savings. And so where it really makes sense are areas where you have a high demand charge. And so, let's just ignore the energy savings and say that goes into maintenance. If we got a $140,000 Tesla Powerwall plus solar project, we get 30% back from the tax credit. If we have a $20 a month demand charge that we're fully reducing each month, then the payback would be 8 years. You could compare that against just doing solar. If we do a $40,000 solar project, and I think, people would agree with me that $2 a watt for 20 kilowatts of solar is a good installation price. And so the question is it going to be cost effective? If we do a $40,000 project and we do 20 kilowatts of solar, and each kilowatt is producing 1.2 kilowatt hours of electricity, and that electricity is worth 6 cents a kilowatt hour, and we have to convert watts to kilowatts. The solar array by itself at 6 cents a kilowatt hour would have and then I guess there is the federal tax credit. The solar array by itself would have a 20-year payback. But because we added $100,000 of batteries onto the $40,000 of solar, we're able to get our payback to be, 8.5 years. So I think that's pretty impressive. That's driving growth in the commercial solar market segment. What we're seeing right now today in 2019, heading into 2020, is the commercial solar market segment is now the fastest growing market segment in the entire industry, because it's gone from having the worst payback in the industry to the best payback in the industry because of what lithium-ion batteries can do, even when those lithium-ion batteries are very expensive. So in the residential market, where you don't have demand charges, you might use flooded lead-acid batteries, because flooded lead-acid batteries are cheaper all around compared to lithium-ion. That might change in a few years, but today, there's nothing more cost-effective than what's basically a forklift battery for large residential storage. At the commercial level, it's real confusing because of technical differences in battery technologies that would make flooded lead acid is good for long term, but not for short term. And in a peaker, you want to deploy all of that battery energy in the short term. You might be completely draining your battery in the morning, and then you want to recharge your battery in the, as you can during the day when you're off peak, to have it be ready for the evening when the solar array is turning on. And so, that commercial solar peaker battery is exercising really hard. So you want a more responsive, more expensive battery technology like lithium ion. At the same time, because you have the ability to save so much with your demand charges, you can afford a higher performance, more expensive battery. And then don't forget that commercial businesses, just like residential customers, don't like losing their power, and they can lose money when they lose their power. You think about all the waste when something goes wrong with your electricity in a grocery store, and regulations require the grocery store to throw all their food out, and that could just be because a car hit the power line outside the grocery store. It doesn't have to be a hurricane that takes off the entire power of the state offline. And so there are some non-monetized benefits, such as like having the ability to weather out a storm. Maybe it's a business opportunity so that you can, if your hotel or your restaurant is the one that's still open during a disaster, you're not only losing money, you're making more money than you normally are. So if you can get a solar peaker to work, you do get some additional backup power capability. Not a lot, not the whole building, but at least critical loads. So we already talked about solar reducing peak demand at the hottest time of the day, so let's keep moving forward. One thing that's on this slide that we haven't really talked about yet is that when we're saying your build for the very highest peak, it's actually broken out commonly into 15-minute intervals or 30-minute intervals. And so commercial customers who are on demand rate charges from the utility will get a download of what's called interval data, and it'll be a value and a multiplier, because their meters are not capable of metering all of the amperage that goes in and out of a large commercial building. And so they have a smaller sensor, and then they multiply that out. But essentially what you're getting here is a 15-minute by 15-minute readout of the building's electrical demand for the entire year, from January 1st down to, it's a huge file, but every single 15-minute interval, the utility, if they're billing you and they're monitoring these 15-minute intervals, then they're also recording it. And so often you can just log into your electrical account, your commercial electrical account, and download this data. And then sometimes you actually have to call the utility and request it. But they got it. And as we said before, this is what's more common for commercial solar rooftops is this, in years past, let's fill up the whole roof, get the best economies of scale, and that's because either we're getting a large subsidy check or we are somehow negotiated with the utility so that we're not needing to worry about energy versus demand. So for instance, in this particular project, not only did we get the 30% tax credit, but we also got, around a 20% state level grant. And then on top of that, the utility wrote a power purchase agreement where they bought every single kilowatt hour of electricity coming out of the array at around retail price. And so why wouldn't we cover up the entire rooftop, do as much solar as we could, if money is just being thrown around like that? But a commercial solar peaker is much more in tune with unsubsidized business models that are just about aggressively attacking the electric bill. And that's why, long-term growth in this application is kind of unstoppable, because, when you think about it, when you look at a meter fee for residential, your residential electric bill might be $200. And so you go from a $20 fixed fee to a $40 fixed fee, and that can have an impact on your user base. But, commercial bill fixed fees are, even though they're more than residential, they're usually like $150. In this one, out of a $4,000 bill, the fixed fee is $66. So fixed fees are a much smaller portion of a commercial electric bill than they are for a residential electric bill. So residential customers are much more exposed to fixed fee changes than commercial. And so really the power company, to combat a commercial solar peaker, the only thing they can do is lower the demand charge and raise the energy charge. And so if you lower the demand charge and raise the energy charge, then you start getting into a solar array that covers the whole roof. If you want to punish solar, then you keep the energy rate low and you increase the demand charge, and that gets you into commercial solar peakers, which, what's kind of interesting is they require less roof space. You don't need a giant rooftop to do a commercial solar peaker. And so again, the real kind of befuddling issue is when you're modeling a commercial solar peaker, and let's say there's a very specific payback where your client or your company will not approve the project unless it's an 8-year payback or less. What you might find is that instead of doing a large project, you do a small project. Because when you're just reducing, the 10% of your energy, and you're deploying that to go after the upper top 10% of the spikiest peaks. At that case, producing 10% of your energy on site can reduce your bill by 30 or 40%. Whereas if you are trying to do 100% of your bill, you could only reduce your bill by 100%, which is a 1-to-1 ratio instead of a 1-to-3 ratio. And so ironically, a smaller project will have a shorter payback period than a larger project, specifically within the realm of commercial solar peakers. There is some optimization that we need to have involved, but if you're running your models and you're like, man, these projects are not going to be cost effective to the point where the project might not make, the solution might be to dial back the project rather than make it larger. This is a kind of an extreme example, but this is a load profile for a large school. And so, right in the morning, the school's energy use takes off. It goes from 200 kilowatts up to almost a megawatt in power. So 50 kilowatts of solar or of batteries is gonna hardly budge this curve. This is not a spike. This is a plateau. This is sustained demand that is occurring throughout the entire day. And so, load leveling, this much or that much or that much, it's like a linear increase in the size of your battery bank. This is a spiky load profile looks like this. Where you just try and go and shave off the peaks. This is not a peak. This is a plateau. So plateaus are very hard for commercial solar peakers. Something with a sustained high demand throughout the entire day is going to take a 10 or a 12-hour battery, whereas if the spike only occurs for 15 minutes, it might only take a 15-minute or 30-minute battery. And so what I'm saying is, you might find that just doing just the tip of your demand load profile as a little pilot project can be a very cost-effective starting point. And so, I guess this is for, not the large companies in the area, but if you're a smaller company and you're like, man, I don't have the clout to do a $10 million commercial solar peaker, selling them a $50,000 commercial solar peaker as a demonstration project can still result in real savings and get your foot in the door as you gain better analytics for doing a larger project down the road. What I would suggest on plateau job sites like this school is that's where solar really comes back into play, where you would do a 500 kilowatt solar array and reduce this load profile during the day by 500 kilowatts, and now you have spikier peaks for your commercial solar battery to come into play. And so one of the values of solar is that it can take a plateau and turn it into a spike for the battery to come in and then have more to do. So it's not that we can't do anything with this job site. It's just that we would probably be looking at a large project to really do anything substantial to that load profile. In other words, spikier loads are better than flat loads or plateau loads. So what we want is a small battery, not a battery that's large enough to run the whole building, not a large battery that's enough to take the whole building off grid, a small battery that's only enough to manage the peaks. The battery needs to be large enough to shave off any peaks, any spiky peaks. And then we also want a solar array that's large enough to kind of shave off those spiky peaks on sunny days in the middle of the day. That solar array still should only be just sized enough to charge the batteries and qualify it for the tax credit, because remember, the energy savings from the solar array are really going to be non-existent. And then as a final consideration, if there are critical loads on the building where there's a clear revenue loss associated with the loss of power, you may want to do a large enough battery and solar array to be able to back up those critical loads. So in identifying the market opportunity for a commercial solar peaker, the best starting point is to say, where are high demand charges to be found in the United States? And I think this makes the commercial solar peaker argument all the more fascinating. There's different kinds of demand-based rate structures. The one we've talked about so far has been a flat one, where your demand charge is just a simple, $15 per kilowatt. Then there's others that break out the demand where you might have a peak demand charge and then an off-peak demand charge. And so you have two separate demand charges going on. And in this case, we would really just target the most expensive of the two. You can have a demand charge that varies by season. Another one that is interesting is a tiered demand charge, where they might be giving you a demand charge based on how many kilowatts you use. And sometimes they'll give you a demand charge that's based off how many kilowatt hours you use. That's a little bit harder to conceptualize. But fundamentally, any kind of commercial rate structure that is not just a basic rate structure like a residential one that is strictly kilowatt hours and that is strictly a flat kilowatt hour rate structure, but anything that's really complicated. So when you're looking at your electric bill for your commercial facility and you're not really seeing a kilowatt hour charge, or you're not really seeing a easy to understand demand charge, but you're seeing something that's broken out into tiers, essentially, no matter how they dice it, they're going to be saying what a tiered rate structure says is, the higher your demand is, we might be increasing your energy rate. And the lower your demand is, we might be decreasing your energy rate, or some variant on that theme. And, essentially the shorter and flatter your load profile can be versus tall and spiky, if you can take a tall and spiky load structure and instead make it long and flat, you'll see a lower electric bill. And that's what a commercial solar peaker can do, is take a tall, spiky energy use profile and kind of topple it over and make it more, short and flat instead of tall and skinny. So the question becomes, where do high demand charges exist? And I've linked a report, although I guess y'all can't really click on it. You'll just have to Google it. But when I got into solar in 2008, and the industry started to become more in tune with the fact that demand charge rate structures did not meet up with solar arrays so well, this data did not exist. You would have to go to every single utility website and do this research yourself to find where demand charges were high, but National Renewable Energy Labs has since surveyed demand charges throughout the United States. And this is what I think is most fascinating about this map. Now, this is a map where it shows you where high demand charges are. Obviously the dark red is worse and yellow is, very little. White is they didn't have any data available. And what we can see is most of the country has demand charges in the $10 to $20 or the $1 to $10 range. So most demand charges are under $20 a kilowatt. Some are over $20 a kilowatt. And what I think is interesting about this is we're used to seeing maps where it's like, okay, the desert is sunny and the northeast coast is gloomy, and so solar produces more in sunny rather than not sunny areas. And then in my other solar programs, I say, okay, but don't forget, in the gloomy northeast, your price of electricity is very expensive. And so, it's not just about production, it's also about value, and so you have to multiply the two. So, okay, well, maybe solar, the best markets are in areas where the price of electricity is high. And so then you get into the markets where the price of electricity is low, not the northeast coast, not California, and solar becomes less cost effective. And so you could be sitting in a market like Mississippi thinking, man, there's no solar market here. Electricity price is average. We don't have net metering, so there's no residential market. And just the assumption is solar does not make economic sense in areas where the price of electricity is cheap, especially when there's no net metering. But as we learned, commercial solar peakers don't care about net metering. The energy outflow is a negligible value, and it's already a negligible value. So that's not what makes the project work. And what we can see about high demand charges is they're really scattered throughout the country. I mean, Iowa would be a great example where you have cheap energy but high demand charges. Mississippi is another example where you have cheap energy but high demand charges. Georgia is a great example where you have cheap energy but high demand charges. And that's pretty much true. I mean, Idaho, you have this whole pocket around Idaho Falls that has sky-high demand charges. And certain areas of Colorado can get out of control too. Basically what we see is that, yes, there are some stereotypical markets like Massachusetts or Long Island or California that have sky-high demand charges. But there are also areas of the country where even though the price of electricity is low, they're rural areas. And in rural areas, you don't have very good grid infrastructure to begin with. And so when a business wants to put a heavy load on the electric grid, that strains the grid. And so to discourage, but it turns out in rural areas, that's a very good place to do agriculture and manufacturing, less environmental consideration because there's less population density. But they're not very good markets for, putting heavy loads on the electric grid. And the result is you get cheap electricity, but heavy demand charges. In Mississippi, we have below average electricity pricing, but New York City demand charges. So kind of one telltale indicator are in markets where the average commercial electric rate is higher than the average residential electric rate. That's a market where you have high demand charges. So, it turns out in New York City, you have both. You have high energy charges and high demand charges. But in, Iowa, you don't. You have cheap energy charges and you have high demand charges. And so what's particularly interesting is commercial solar peakers are a more universal market. You can't do much if you have a low demand charge. But there are markets where the price of electricity is below the national average, but even so, the demand charge is well above the national average. And it kind of depends on how the utility has chosen to slice and dice their electric bills, but it also tends to do with rural areas. There's more political pressure not to punish the residential market for being in the rural area. And so, they go to the manufacturer and they say, look, we're going to give you the cheapest possible rate we can give you for energy. We're going to sell you the energy basically for its cost. You're buying your energy for what it's costing the power company to buy the coal. But we're going to charge you out the ears for demand. And so it turns out that there are sites where you have commercial customers with very low energy rates, very high demand rates, and these can be in rural areas where there's no solar market to begin with. And so it might be that, solar works really, really well for large businesses in rural areas, where the solar market does not otherwise exist. So if we're really interested about expanding the solar industry, not just for markets where the price of electricity is high, but expanding solar throughout the rest of the United States as well, honing in on commercial solar peakers is very important. This graph is a little bit less important. Well, I don't know. This is the number of customers where the demand charges are high and there's still a lot of customers. So like West Virginia in particular is a good market for commercial solar peakers, or Utah is a great market for commercial solar peakers because you have both high demand charges and a lot of customers. But really all you really need, in Georgia as well, but really all you need is high demand charges for commercial solar peakers to work. And so these are not necessarily the states. West Virginia you don't think about as a solar state. Iowa is not a solar state. But that does not mean that there aren't these opportunities that are kind of untapped that are beginning to come to market. We looked at the electric bill already. And it's important to understand commercial electric bills. There are some rate adjustments. Sometimes they're percentage-based, like taxes. And so you'll look and you'll say, okay, well, my demand charge is in this case, it's $26 per kilowatt. But then that's increasing by 2% tax, 3% tax, 4% tax, and another 3%, another 1%. Geez. So that's really a good, 10 to 15% higher than that. And so that's where you're getting into, $30 a kilowatt demand charges in the most extreme cases. The energy is dirt cheap. The energy is a penny a kilowatt hour plus the fuel charge. Okay, so when we're beginning our commercial solar peaker design, the best thing to do is to graph it visually so that you can understand kind of what you're up against or what you're facing. So here we have a Colorado dentist office. And I was able to get the 15-minute interval data from the client, and we just put it into Microsoft Excel and graphed it throughout the entire year. And so what this is telling us, I always say put a narrative to your load profile and see what's going on. We can say, okay, well, obviously we have some very spiky loads, and they're really ramping up in the winter time. And then by the summertime, you still have spiky loads, but they're not nearly as spiky as they were, and they're not extreme like they were in the wintertime. Although there are some outliers. Here's one lone spike, and who knows, if that was a facility snafu, maybe it was a move-in day or something, and the doors were open to the office all day. But it's really, we see our heavy demand coming in the winter, and so what we're suspecting is that the office is on a electric heating system. And so we zoom in, and this here we're zooming in June. And so in June, we're still seeing some spikes in our demand that are just occurring for a short time in the day. And then the rest of the day, we drop back down. So what we would say is, this is our daytime base load. And this is our true base load, our sustained base load. And then we have our peak, base load. And then everything else above that are spikes. And so what we can see, zooming in a little further, is that our spike is occurring, this is 8 a.m., 8:15, 8:30, 8:45, 9, and then by 9:15 or 9:30, we're down at our base load throughout the rest of the day. And so, essentially, it's, this is for February. And so what we see is they're turning their heaters on right at the beginning of the day, and then you have all of your other electrical, your dental equipment starting up, your computers starting up, your employees showing up to work and opening up the work refrigerator door and shutting it. We see this ramp up at the beginning of the day, and then nothing else throughout the rest of the day, which is great. What this tells me is we could have 1 hour of battery storage capability. Well, what it also is saying is we could have a system output capacity. This is 100 kilowatts. This is 25 kilowatts, and the rest is 15 kilowatts. To do a full demand management, with this project could easily accommodate a 75 kilowatt output capacity. And if we're trying to do it for an hour, and we're not at the full 75 rated kilowatts for the full hour, but we still need that output capacity to come out of the system. But what we're looking at is maybe an average of maybe an average of 50 kilowatt hours of demand reduction for a 1 hour time frame. And so, if we put this on even as small as a 50 kilowatt hour battery bank, we might see a little bit of an updraft in demand during that time, but we could take care of a huge chunk of it. Now, here's another weird one in August. Now, what we see in August is a little bit higher of a base load demand than in the wintertime. And so they are running some air conditioners in August, and that's driving up their base load electricity. But we don't really care about any of that for a commercial solar peaker. We're not trying to have a solar array power all of this. We're just trying to have a solar array power that. And so again, this is between an 80 and a 20. So this would be about a 60 kilowatt output capacity, just for 15 minutes. And so that would only need, about a 15 kilowatt hour battery to reduce that demand for that month. And of course, that if this demand is 80% of their electric bill, and we reduce that demand charge from 80 to 20, we've reduced their electric bill by 75% for the month just by adding a 15 kilowatt hour battery with a 60 kilowatt output capacity to the system, provided that our battery can be discharged that quickly. So we're going to talk about that when we get into our battery chemistry discussion a little bit later. Well, then we see some days in the spring and fall where we have a much more even load profile, and there's really not much opportunity for doing demand management on these days. That's okay. We're not trying to provide energy to the building to enough to power them for every single day of the year. We're really only trying to provide enough power to give them a little bit of a haircut. Not quite sure why this is. Okay, so the reason why this slide is in is who are the commercial customers that have high demand charges? Typically small commercial customers are going to be billed like residential. And so your small commercial customers will not have a demand rate structure. I'd say the most common line is for the utility to say, if your demand is ever above 50 kilowatts, we will put you on a demand charge. And if your demand is less than 50 kilowatts, we'll keep you at a residential level. So pretty much any building that has 3 or more 200 amp service panels. So a shoe store that only has one 200 amp service panel. A kitchen, a small restaurant that only has 2 200 amp service panels may not be on a demand charge. But many businesses, especially larger businesses, are on these kinds of demand charges. So this is like a Colorado rate structure where if you're under 50 kilowatts, you're being billed 10 cents a kilowatt hour for your electricity. And then if you go over 50 kilowatts, you're billed 1 cent a kilowatt hour for your electricity, but $30 a kilowatt as a demand charge. So when we're building out our model, we start out with, that interval data that will tell us, how much, what our load is going to be for every single hour of the day or every 15-minute interval of the day. PV watts is only going to give us hourly information. And so here we see our demand, our building demand spiking, at 8 and it goes up to, this is our solar array from PV watts. We got our hourly information. So how do we take our PV watts data and our building interval data to determine, how large of a system do we need or how large of a battery bank do we need? See, I'm going to get in. Let me just pull up the Excel file I put together and kind of show you how I went about building it. First we start with our PV watts data. So when we go to PV watts and we download this 1 kilowatt array for Louisville, Kentucky, and remember we got our annual production. We also have our month-by-month production. And we scroll down and get the hourly information. Here's our hourly information. And in other classes, we get into what you can do with all this data. For example, beam irradiance versus diffuse irradiance will tell you if it's a sunny day versus a cloudy day, which can be useful for off-grid modeling if you want to know how many cloudy days in a row you need for your off-grid house. But what we're really interested in is the column at the end of the line that's AC system output. And this is for a 1 kilowatt solar array. Right here, 1 kilowatt. So what I'll do in my models is I'll take another column and I'll say, okay, well, this is the output for 1 kilowatt. And then I'll put in another column that'll be the size of my solar array. So I'll take the first column and then I'll multiply it by the second column, all the way through. And what that does is it creates a scalar. And so now I can kind of toggle my solar array size. If I want to do it for a 50 kilowatt array versus a 100 kilowatt array versus a 1 kilowatt array, that's my output capacity. And in fact, this is output capacity in watts, and that's not very useful. Our interval data is in kilowatts, and so I'll divide by 1,000 to get my output data to be in kilowatts. And that's just so I can run a bunch of different simulations based off different system sizes. Another issue that's a little bit hard when you're doing this from scratch, when you're trying to build an Excel model, is that PV watts is going to give you a printout for every hour of the day and every month of the year, but your interval data is broken out by 15-minute periods. Well, that's actually not too hard. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take this PV watts data, and it's already broken out by month, day, and hour, and I'm just going to copy it 4 times. But I want 15-minute interval data, and I only have hourly interval data, and so I'm just going to copy and paste it 4 times, and then go, I'm going to get rid of some of the headers here. I'm going to go and delete those. And then just go in and data and sort, again by month of the year, and then by day of the year, and by hour of the year. And so now, instead of having hourly data, my data is now broken out by 15-minute window. And what I'm assuming, I eliminated my header row, my formula row. So I have another row that's like for system size, and this was originally done for a 1 kilowatt. Now I'm doing it for a 20, so we're multiplying this by 20. And so now I have an output for my solar array that is, here's my watts for every 15-minute window. Now remember, here I'm not tabulating energy, I'm tabulating wattage, which is instant. And so if PV watts is telling me that my 20 kilowatt solar array is outputting 20 kilowatt, it's outputting nothing at midnight because the sun's not up. But if I'm and do a little formatting to make the data a little bit easier to process here. But what PV watts is saying is that my 20 kilowatt solar array at January 1st at 8 a.m. is at 5 kilowatts. And so I'm assuming that at 8:15, it's also at 5 kilowatts. And at 8:30, it's also at 5 kilowatts. And at 8:45, it's also at 5 kilowatts. And then at 9 a.m., it goes up to 8 kilowatts. And at 10 a.m., it goes up to 10 kilowatts. And that's about as much as it does for the day. So I'm just assuming that my hourly power level for my solar array is going to be the same as my 15-minute power level for the solar array. So by taking your PV watts data and just duplicating it 4 times, you can go from your power levels for every hour of the day, every day of the year, to every 15 minutes for every hour of the day and every day of the year. And so you can take your interval data. I actually don't use Excel anymore. I go and use Google Sheets. But so here we have, let's see if I can zoom a little bit, make it easier on the eyes. So here we have our 25 kilowatt array size and our interval data with our building demand. And we're basically subtracting the building demand from the array production to give us our new building demand. So we haven't added a battery yet. And so here our solar array, our building demand is at 40 kilowatts and our 30 kilowatts, and our solar array is at 9 kilowatts. And so the solar array has reduced our building demand by 9 kilowatts, bringing us to an adjusted demand of 21 kilowatts. So we're subtracting our old building demand from our solar array demand to get our new building demand. So now we have our new building demand after solar. And so at that point, we can examine our load profile data again visually, but what we know from this particular building is there's not going to be much of a change because we have such a huge spike in the morning when our solar array is not going to be really up yet. And so at that point, we need to say, okay, well, now we have to start modeling a battery. And so here's what I did is I just kind of assumed that we had a target. And so our target's going to say, okay, well, we don't want to disqualify our business from the demand rate structure. If we lower our demand to be under 50 kilowatts, they're going to say, okay, we're moving you on to the residential type electric rate. So what we want to do is stay above 50 kilowatts, but then reduce our demand to, right just below 50 kilowatts. So we'll say, okay, let's go with 51. All right. Well, we're under 50, we're under 50, we're under 50, we're under 50, so we're not using our battery bank. Well, here our building demand is above 50 kilowatts, and our new target is 51. And so we basically run our battery at a, it will make this a little bit easier on the eyes. There we go. So our building demand was at 56 kilowatts. Some, capacity out of our battery bank. And so here in this column, we have our battery bank starting size. Now I would just recommend saying, and the problem is you can't toggle these too much because it has to recalculate every column, but we can get an idea of our battery bank size. Let's just say we had no battery and it didn't have any capacity in it. Well, if we're basically what we're saying is that if our demand is greater than our target, then we're going to run the battery. Otherwise, do nothing. So here we're subtracting our demand down to our target level in this one. But basically we're saying, if our demand is greater than our target, then run the battery and take power out of our battery, otherwise do nothing. So why is this showing, we're going down from 56 kilowatts down to 51 kilowatts, and yet we're only taking 1 kilowatt hour out of our battery bank? Well, that's because, remember, these are not 1 hour intervals, these are 15-minute intervals. And so we're dividing that power by 4 to get how much it's draining our battery. Here, our demand spikes up, and so to get it down to 51, we have to take 11 kilowatt hours over a 15-minute interval out of our battery bank, and so on and so forth. And so essentially what we're getting, and then we're taking the top state and making it cumulative. And so effectively, we're assuming that we have no battery, but if we needed a battery, how large would our battery need to be in order for our battery not to go negative? So how that kind of relates to the slide is I've charted the battery bank size, and you say, okay, well, our battery is going to be getting down to, that scale doesn't go very well. What I'll do is just go into my Excel sheet and do a search for the minimum value of the capacity of our battery bank. And you say, okay, well, our battery bank needs to be at least 154 kilowatt hours in order for it to work as I've programmed it and not be completely drained. So basically, we start out with a 154 kilowatt hour battery. Our building demand is, all of a sudden we start using our battery to get down to that 51 kilowatt demand level. 51 kilowatts, 51 kilowatts, 51 kilowatts. And then all of a sudden our battery starts to increase in size, and that's because, all of a sudden our new building demand with solar is negative, and we're putting that surplus power production back into our battery and recharging it. And so, we can look at this by examining every single cell, but putting it to a picture makes it a lot easier. The short of it is we need a 154 kilowatt battery bank so that our battery doesn't deplete. But don't forget, I also have a cell in here for the solar array size. And so I could go and just, let's go back to a no battery. And by subtracting the building demand from the solar array production and determining when we're over our demand target, that drives the minimum battery bank level. If I go and I say, okay, well, instead of doing a 25 kilowatt array, what would happen if we did a 50 kilowatt array? You would assume that would reduce the size requirement on the battery. And so we're crunching the numbers. And we go from needing a 154 kilowatt hour battery to needing a 145 kilowatt hour battery. Now that's only a difference of 9 kilowatt hours. That's not very much. Let's say if I did a 10 kilowatt solar array. Again, these files are large, so they take a while to crunch the numbers. Now, if I needed a 10 kilowatt array, I need 191 kilowatt hours in my battery bank. And so by going from 10 kilowatts of solar to 25 kilowatts of solar, I'm saving about 40 kilowatt hours of battery capacity. But if I go from 25 kilowatts to 50 kilowatts, I only save 9. And so I've hit kind of a maximum or an inflection point somewhere in that array size to say, 50 is too much, 10 is too small. And so you can kind of just toggle your array size to hone in on what's cost effective. Now, I'll look at, as a solar designer, I know my project sizes and my ordering quantities. And I know that 25 kilowatts is equal to 3 pallets of solar. And so I'll often increment my solar array size based off how many pallets of solar I need to buy. And that gets me to a demand target of 51. And so I'm looking at my load and I'm saying, okay, well, I'm going from 94 to 51. I'm going from 101 to 51, 91 to 51. For this much demand reduction. Not all months I'm above 51 kilowatts. You're really not going to be pushed into a demand rate. You'll be pushed into a demand rate structure if just 1 month is above 50 kilowatts. And so actually I kind of made a mistake on this first iteration of this graph, and I don't mind sharing this this file with you so you can poke around in it. That's kind of what's nice about Google. So I can make this publish it to the web and give you a link so that you can make a copy of it and play around with it yourself. Let me put that into the chat. There you go. And we're going to show you how this gets translated into commercial solar battery design software, but it's good to know what's going on under the hood. What I've done in my next iteration of the same data is I've said, okay, well, if I only need to go to 51 kilowatts 1 month of the year, which month is that going to be? And I can go back to my chart of his various demand levels, and I can say, okay, well, here it is for the whole year. I can say, okay, well, some months are worse than others, and it turns out that in not in January, but actually in February and in December, I have the highest demand constraints, at least for this particular year. So I'm going to say, okay, well, my maximum demand is in February. And so what I'm going to say is in January and in March and in April and in May, I have to buy the system that is optimal, and I'm going to use it harder. It's going to be pushed to the limit in February. It's going to be pushed to the limit in December. But I might be able to get even more extreme in my demand management for the other months. I don't have to stay at the 50 kilowatt limit. And so what I've done in the second iteration is, unlike the first iteration where I had a demand target for the entire year, and so up in the Excel, in the formula page, basically I said, if the building demand is above 51 kilowatts, run the battery and take capacity out of the battery and tell me what the minimum battery size I need so that that battery doesn't go negative. And so, what I need is, if I have a 155 kilowatt hour battery, at no point is my battery bank going to go negative. At no point am I going to run out of juice in that battery and be able to hit that target. Now that's kind of, it's not the most conservative calculation, but if I have a 156 kilowatt hour battery bank, the lowest, the minimum I'm going to hit is 2. And that's probably going to be sometime in February. Now that's with an array size of 25 kilowatts. And so what I've done in the second iteration is, instead of having this as a 51 kilowatt target for the entire year, I'm going to say, okay, well, there's certain months where I can run my solar peaker to demand targets that are below 51 kilowatts and still keep the client on the 51 kilowatt demand rate structure. And so I say, okay, well, can I go to a 45 kilowatt load level without depleting my battery in the month of January? Can I go to March in the month of January without getting into my lowest battery level? And so what I've done here in my second iteration model is I've gotten rid of that demand management target, and instead I've referenced the next page and say, what's my new target? And looked at my minimum battery level size, and I say, okay, well, let's just go ahead and make this positive here. And as the graph is more complicated, as the inputs are more complicated, it takes longer to calculate. But for basically, I'm looking at every single month of the year, and I'm asking myself, okay, under this current data set, it takes a while for these numbers to crunch. Come on now. I'm also on a DSL internet speed, so that might have something to do with it. Well, give me 1 minute. Okay, so what I'm saying is, as it stands, if I have a 50 kilowatt solar array and a 170 kilowatt hour battery bank, my minimum battery level is 2.32. And I say, okay, well, if I work my system a little bit harder in January, if my maximum load is not 45 kilowatts, it's say, 35 kilowatts, well, then it recrunches all the numbers. And what it should tell me after recrunching all the numbers is because I'm working my battery a lot harder, all of a sudden we'll see this battery level go negative. And it'll say, okay, well, if you want to work your battery harder in January to achieve that level, then you're going to have a larger battery to make the system work. So we're going to see that in a minute. But basically, by using brute force, without using any optimization algorithms, but by using brute force, so it didn't go down. And so really what I'm looking at in the month of January is my 170 kilowatt hour battery bank and how it's being used. And I'm seeing for the month of January, what I might do is go and put down what's the minimum that it gets down to for the month of January, what's the minimum it gets down to for the month of February. See, now I'm still just on January 7th. And so here I'm in a storm system in January, or a peaker system, where my 170 kilowatt hour at the start of the day, the battery is dropping all the way down to about 45 kilowatt hours before the solar array charges it back up again. And so I'm looking for something a little bit more extreme than that. That got down to my minimum. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to scroll down all the way to January 31st. Let's speed this process up a little bit. And I'm going to say, all right, on January 31st, up to January 1st, the minimum I get into is 44 kilowatt hours of my battery bank size. And so can I drive my load down even further, maybe down to, let's say 20 kilowatts, and work my battery even further to see what my lowest battery level is. So here I've done it already in this column where I already have so now I'm down at a negative 18. And so to kind of fine tune this model, I'm going to go for every month of the year and say, okay, well, for February, we're at 52. So we're not going to touch February anymore. We did increase and in December, we're at 2. So we could actually go perhaps a little bit stronger in February and maybe a little bit stronger in March. That goes down to negative 38. But what you can see is we're examining every single billing cycle. So it's a month-long billing cycle. We're looking at every billing cycle and saying, okay, what is the most amount of demand reduction I can do here I still have plenty left in my battery bank. And so, I could say, okay, well, I'm going to lower that down to maybe 5 as my new demand instead of 42. But what we saw earlier is that means that whereas our base load is kind of around 15 to 20 kilowatts, if I'm getting my power demand now down to 5 kilowatts, I'm going to be running my battery, a lot. But, actually in June, I might be able to get rid of my load on the grid entirely. Oh, no, I can't. That would take a heck of a lot of battery capacity. And so you just have to come up with, either an optimization algorithm or just kind of manual testing. And then, of course, you gotta be a little conservative. But what we kind of already knew going into it is that the wintertime months are going to be the hardest ones, and then the sunnier, cooler months are going to be much easier. And then we're going to stay right above 51 kilowatts in December. And so with some kind of fine tuning of our model, so in this case, a 30 kilowatt target for February was too much and it drained our battery. So we're going to move that back up. Likewise, 15 was too much. 5 here was too much. Even 20. Well, let's just wait and see what our new numbers are. And so now we've kind of pushed our demand as far as the battery will allow us to. More aggressive with our modeling. And so at the end of the day, we say, okay, well, this was for a solar array. That was 50 kilowatts in size. And I'm going to spare you the exercise of going through and iterating this for like a 25 kilowatt array, a 50 kilowatt array, a 100 kilowatt array. But you would be varying not just your battery bank size, but also your demand targets and also your solar array, and kind of exploring the extremes of all of them. A small solar array, a large solar array, a small battery, a large battery. When you say, okay, well, that 50 kilowatt array was done at $2 a watt. And the all-in price of our battery system, which is, in our case, remember our battery size in this model is 170 kilowatt hours. So if our 170 kilowatt hour battery bank costs $700 a kilowatt hour, and our solar array costs $2 a watt, then our total project is $219,000. um, broken out across these two budgets. And then after the 30% tax credit and our demand savings, we get an 8-year payback. Okay. Well, I want to see if there's a payback that's even smaller than 8 years. And so generally what I'm going to do in this case is say, well, let's try and look at what we can do with a smaller solar array. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to do a 25 kilowatt solar array. And maybe let's go ahead and do a smaller battery bank. Let's do maybe a 120 kilowatt hour battery bank. So, we were looking at an 8.3 year payback. Here our battery bank is now negative, so we have to do a little bit less load reduction. Maybe a lot less load reduction. So I'm just going to put in some values here to make sure our battery bank is not going negative. And so what I'm kind of picking up on is that in our last system iteration, we were oversized. And I'm saying we're oversized because we were getting, in some months, we were getting our demand levels all the way down to 5 or 10 kilowatts. But we saw earlier, for example, that when we looked in the summertime months, our base load is kind of right at 20 kilowatts. And so we really don't want our solar peaker to be lowering our demand more than that, because then we're buying batteries to do all of this short, flat peak. And we want, for maximum cost effectiveness, to just focus on tall and skinny. And so now I'm going back into the model and I'm going to approach it from the other end. I'm saying, okay, well, I'm really just trying to do demand management down to, 25 kilowatts. And so here I'm in an instance where, we have and in December, what we can see is I'm not getting there by a long shot. And so what I'm going to look at in December is to say, okay, well, maybe I missed my target in December and I can only do 60 kilowatts of load reduction instead of 50. Or I go back and I say, okay, well, I just need to add 14 more kilowatt hours. Maybe I didn't have a large enough battery, or maybe I went too small on the solar array, although given that it's December, that's probably not going to be the case. And so I just kind of play with my targets. And now all of a sudden, instead of having a $220,000 project that has an 8-year payback, I have instead of having a 50 kilowatt solar array at $2 a watt, I have a 25 kilowatt solar array at $2 a watt. That's a $50,000 solar scope. Instead of doing a 170 kilowatt hour battery bank, I'm doing, what was it? Going back to my slide, I'm doing a 120 kilowatt hour battery bank. So I've substantially reduced the size of my battery bank. So instead of doing $100,000 of solar and $120,000 of batteries, I'm doing $50,000 of solar and $85,000 of batteries. So I'm doing a smaller project rather than a larger project. I'm not doing quite as much demand reduction, but I'm also shaving off those peakiest of the peaks. And instead of getting a 8.5 year payback, I'm getting a 6.5 year payback. And so then I might go and say, okay, I see there's questions. I'm going to get to them in just a minute. If I do anything smaller than a 25 kilowatt array, I'm not going to get that $2 a watt installation price. So I'm pretty much kind of crapped out on my solar array size. Or am I? I guess that's an assumption. Let me do like a 14 kilowatt array, or even let's push it. Let's do a one pallet. Let's do an 8 kilowatt solar array. I need to go check my battery levels. So now my solar array is not doing enough to charge my battery. So let's bring this demand savings back up. And it's by a long shot. So, a 7 kilowatt solar array was pushing it too much. That's not enough to recharge my batteries. Or an 8 kilowatt array. And so let's put it back up to 25 kilowatts. Then the question is, am I spending the right amount on my battery or the right amount on my solar array? And I can see, well, yeah, I am spending substantially more on my battery than on my solar array, so I'm probably in the right kind of range. And a 6.5 year payback or so is about the best that I'm going to get. And if I look at this and I say, okay, well, I'm kind of cutting it close on my battery bank size, and I want to be a little bit more conservative in my estimate and make sure I'm, for most of the time, leaving myself with a happy, healthy range. Because if you completely drain your battery, then you've played all the cards in your hand. So, the lower you get in your battery level, the less conservative your model is going to be. So can I do any more kind of extreme demand reduction than this and still have pretty good performance? It's kind of, how much fine tuning do you want to do? What's going to be acceptable to your client? So I'm going to let Google adjust these changes. I'm going to push a little bit more here. I'll go down to 10. See what happens. And so about my payback number is not changing all that much. So we're looking at, for this particular client, about a 6-year payback, which is pretty interesting. They might be able to go out and get a capital equipment loan and, have the project kind of cash flow at that level. This was too much, getting too far into base load. So we're gonna kind of raise that back up. Okay, let me look at some questions. Okay, so where are we getting the 700 number from? So 700 at $700 a kilowatt hour. So that's a good question. We haven't really talked about battery pricing yet. When we're looking at the Tesla Powerwall, we're looking at it's the Tesla Powerwall is $10,000, and that's for about a 12 kilowatt hour battery bank. And so the Tesla Powerwall is about $833 per kilowatt hour. And so I'm just assuming that, by not necessarily using Tesla, but by, using a more, instead of using 10 Tesla Powerwalls, you might be using a Tesla Power Pack, which is a commercial product they have, whereas the Powerwall is more of a residential product. Or if you're doing something else, like buying a non-Tesla battery inverter and non-Tesla lithium-ion batteries, that you might be able to achieve a better installation price simply because you have more site-specific components selected. And so I guess what I'm trying to encourage you to see is that, we'll look at some commercial solar design software. But what I want you to see is that building an Excel model on your own by simply taking your interval data and then subtracting your solar production and then coming up with demand target thresholds and an economic model. It's not impossible to do it with good old-fashioned, spreadsheets. And taking a close look at your load profiles helps you do that. So I can see that, any demand reductions in spring and fall here are, anything that's above 20 kilowatts is going to, get rid of any big spikes, but not anything, I'm not going to be using base load. And so I guess the rule of thumb for cost-effective commercial solar peakers is stay away from having the battery reduce your baseload demand and instead, just do a system that is only so large enough to do your spiky loads. And so here I'm looking at like my minimum required battery bank sizes. I'm looking at establishing individual load targets for each month. And so in this case, I'm doing why don't we, since we're here, why don't we go ahead and plug in these numbers into the spreadsheet and go and do a 14. We looked at the solar array before and we did 8, but we didn't really look at a 14 kilowatt array. And then yet an even smaller project, not 120 kilowatt hours, but 90 kilowatt hours. Then we go look at our load targets and we say, okay, well, in February, we got to be a little bit higher than that. In June, you need to get back up there. In July, we need to get back up, get out of the base load. I'll let this catch back up. And so here I'm saying, okay, I'm really cutting it close here with my most extreme. This would be something that would be quite conservatively modeled. So why don't I take a little bit of the conservatism out of it, and then some. And say, all right, well, these are pretty realistic, easily achievable numbers. If our battery bank is a 90 kilowatt hour battery bank, then I'm leaving more than enough reserve capacity in the tank to make sure I can hit this model. And what I'm seeing on my payback now, why don't, if we kept it similar to the slides, if this is $700 a kilowatt hour, we could even adjust that to be a little bit more realistic. Maybe that 14 kilowatt solar array, it's smaller, so maybe it's $3 a watt instead of $2 a watt. Our battery bank is a little bit smaller, so maybe it's 740 a kilowatt hour instead of 700 a kilowatt hour. But even so, we see our payback continue to shrink. Now, instead of being over a 6-year payback, we are under a 6-year payback. And I think that pretty much demonstrates the value of smaller if you're modeling a commercial solar peaker and you're finding that the economics are just not there to make the project work, almost counterintuitively, the answer is to go smaller rather than larger. So Derek says, when you manually adjust the demand numbers, does that mean the client would have to commit to using less power during those months, i.e. adjust the thermostats, etc.? That's a great question. The answer is no. We have to remember this model is based off their unadjusted energy habits. And so, for the model to achieve these savings, they don't have to do anything to adjust their energy use. Energy use adjustments would only make the model would make the model more conservative and less likely to fail. But the way that it happens with these battery management systems is it really depends on what product class you're buying and how large you're buying. But the inverters will have either dumb or smart controls, and I've modeled it using dumb controls. So in my model, you're basically programming the inverter for each billing cycle. And so in my model, you'd be programming it to say, okay, in the January billing cycle, whenever the building demand goes above 50 kilowatts, reduce it down to 50 kilowatts. For the month of January, I know that's going to be a harder month. So, for the month, and that might be because you're using the building more often. But, basically I'm saying, okay, well now, if the demand is above 60 kilowatts, reduce it down to 60. And so you're setting by month different power levels of the battery inverter to say, okay, in May and April and June, restrict the building facility draw to 20 kilowatts or 40 kilowatts of power, but don't work so hard in February. Let the building go up to 60 kilowatts, because otherwise you'll run out of battery capacity. And so it's a hard-coded number on the battery inverter. Now, that will apply to almost every battery inverter system on the market, regardless of manufacturer. When you get into more commercial grade products, so right now we're talking about, like, you could just go and use battery inverters that every solar installer doing off-grid is using. You just use them in a demand management mode rather than an off-grid mode. And you can go and buy lithium-ion batteries and wire them up to these inverters and hit these numbers. What your Tesla power packs and Delta inverters, and we'll be talking about these more tomorrow, will do is apply more intelligent PID feedback controls for throttling the battery, which could push the demand savings even further. And this is still a new market niche. And so where, like, the battery inverter companies are looking at is saying, well, where does weather forecasting get into this? Where if I actually know what the weather is going to be or not, I might adjust my battery inverter and be able to squeeze even more value out of it. So I'm kind of, for this model, starting with the assumption that you just want to keep it simple and dumb and just go and buy the, not lock yourself into any manufacturer's product platform and be able to achieve these budgets through kind of a conservative modeling. But there is more intelligence than what I've introduced you to that are being applied to load reduction battery systems for even greater value